Good morning and welcome to our stakeholder event for the publication of our Annual Review 2023. I'm Huma Yusuf and I'm Director of Business Integrity here at British International Investment. I'll be your host for today's event. Our goal today is to provide you with an overview of the work we've been doing over the last year and offer you the chance to ask our CEO and Chair some questions. Having worked at BII for 6 years, including directly supporting our investees to build better businesses, I'm especially pleased to be hosting today's event. And that's because the theme for this annual review is Creating Impact Together. This theme goes to the heart of how British International Investment makes a difference. We invest to reduce poverty, to promote equality, and to combat the climate crisis. But we know we cannot achieve this impact alone. We work in partnership with many others, with investment partners, with entrepreneurs, and with the countries where we invest. And throughout today's event, you'll hear about how partnerships are enabling us to have a positive impact, both on people's lives and on the planet. So let's take a look at today's agenda. First up, we have our chair, Diana Layfield, who will provide her perspective on 2023, the progress made by BII and by our partners, and our ambitions for the future. Diana will then hand over to our CEO, Nick O'Donoghue, who will provide a more detailed overview of our work in 2023. As you may know, this will be Nick's last annual review, as he will be standing down later this year. So we're really looking forward to hearing some of his reflections on how BII has evolved since he joined in 2017. We'll then go on to host 2 panel sessions, which will look at 2 key areas of impact: our impact on people's lives and our impact on the planet. We are pleased to be joined by several of our investees and other partners to explore these themes today. Our first panel will be chaired by my colleague, Colin Buckley, Managing Director and General Counsel at BII, who will host a session on impact on people, partnerships to support those most in need. He'll be joined by our partners from Invest for Impact Nepal, the Africa Resilience Investment Accelerator, and GridWorks. Working on the ground in different countries and across diverse sectors and striving to make a difference, our panelists have many interesting experiences and insights to share. For our second panel, my colleague Maria Smith, our Chief Impact Officer, will be joined by 3 more of our investee partners: Sun Culture, New Forests, and Wavemaker Impact. Together, they'll explore the theme, Impact on the Planet, Partnerships to Support Climate Innovation. They'll be talking about how far-sighted solutions and partnerships, from climate tech to carbon credits, are helping to combat the climate emergency. And then Nick and Diana will return for our No Questions Barred Q&A. As always, you can ask whatever you like, and they will, as far as they can, answer as fully as possible. So please start thinking about what you'd like to ask them and put your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We're expecting well over 500 participants today, so we'll do our very best to get through as many of your questions as possible. I hope you agree we have a great agenda for you today. So let's get started. I'm delighted to introduce our chair, Diana Layfield.
Thank you, Huma, for that introduction. And a very warm welcome to everyone here with us in London and to all of you joining virtually for our annual review event. To reiterate what Huma has said, please do send us your questions. I'd like to begin by reflecting on the theme of this year's annual review, Creating Impact Together. No country has ever escaped poverty without developing a thriving private sector. And those living in the poorest region are also at the greatest risk from the negative effects of climate change. But building successful economies and meeting the climate challenge depends upon investment. And the people and the places most in need of capital sadly end up receiving the least. That is why BII exists today. We support the growth of sustainable economies that work for both people and the planet. Through our investment, we aim to create greater security for people, more jobs and opportunities, tax revenues for governments, and to combat the causes and effects of the climate emergency. But we can't achieve this impact alone. As the UK's long-term investor into developing economies, we work in partnership with many others, with you, with our investment partners, with entrepreneurs, and with the countries where we invest. We want our partners to achieve the success that will lead to further prosperity and help meet the huge challenge of climate change. The UK's support can pave the way for widespread investment that gives partner governments the long-term means to provide for their people and end aid dependency. I was fortunate enough to visit some of our businesses just last week in Pakistan. I met with customers at Cash Foundation, a microfinance institution that lends money to women entrepreneurs. I met a group of determined women running small businesses in their homes to create additional income for their families. They were generating a whole host of economic activity, embroidering garments, making bags, or providing beautician services. They were able to do that as a result of the loans they received from Cash. We're immensely proud to support the company's impressive efforts to promote female entrepreneurship. I heard extraordinary stories from each of the women of how they transformed their own lives and that of their families. One was supporting a disabled child and elderly parent. Many had husbands who were day-wage workers with unreliable incomes, and these women had managed to become the family breadwinner. Most had no alternative support or funding route which would support their aspiration to start or grow a small business. But what was hugely compelling for me was the fact that all of them were choosing to prioritise their children's education, including their daughters. I also had the chance to visit Zephyr Power, a renewable energy company in the country that has developed a 50-megawatt wind power plant. Not only is the company generating clean, green power to help address energy poverty and the climate emergency, but it is also addressing the nature crisis. The company is restoring and nurturing mangrove forests to guard against tidal erosion. Seeing the transformation in the landscape from the desolate, which is the default pattern in the area and common across the other concessions, to one where the mangroves help to recreate an entire thriving ecosystem with crabs, lungfish, and other activity we saw. Activity which over time is increasing the fish yield in the area while making the entire system more sustainable. This was truly impressive. And to do this in the context of a core business generating renewable power for the next generation was a great example of our climate work in action. These are just two examples from our portfolio. Examples of how our investment is based on respectful partnership. Examples of how we're backing companies to achieve for their own communities and their families. That is what British International Investment does best. It provides investment that matters to developing countries. We back them to achieve. In that respect, 2023 was a year of progress. Against a very challenging global backdrop, I was pleased we were able to continue to commit a significant amount of capital to new businesses, over £1.3 billion. Today, we have investment relationships with nearly 1,500 businesses across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean. We continue to focus our capital and support on the people and places that need it the most. Whether that's finding ways to bring capital to the most fragile and vulnerable markets, or ensuring our finance reaches people on the lowest of incomes. By investing so that they can access basic goods and services like electricity and access to finance. So they can improve their livelihoods through employment and sell their products at a fair price. We are already the UK government's largest provider of climate finance to emerging markets. But we want to go even further on climate finance. In particular, we want to mobilise significantly more private capital into the emerging economies where we invest. So while we've been making progress on all fronts, we know that there is much, much more to do. As we speak, there is the state opening of Parliament here in the UK following the recent general election. We now have a new Labour government, and I know that that government believes profoundly in development, in tackling poverty in its roots, in supporting economic growth, climate action, and in promoting equality for women and girls. We're very much looking forward to working with David Lammy and Annalise Dodds to advance this shared agenda. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank Andrew Mitchell, the departing Minister for Development, for his work and contributions to development and BII over many years. Throughout its 75-year history, BII is an institution that has demonstrated an unwavering consistency of purpose. Like the new government, we believe in delivering a sustainable development agenda based on genuine respect and partnership, with the goal of ensuring our long-term investment helps countries build fairer, safer, and more prosperous futures for their people. I'd like to end with thanks. First, to our civil service partners at FCDO. Thank you for everything that you do in supporting our mandate. Thanks also to you, our audience, for your continued support, interest, and challenge. I know that scrutinising our performance is a crucial part of the accountability mechanism, but most importantly, it helps guide us to better solutions. And of course, I want to profoundly thank every member of staff at BII for their continuing dedication and hard work. Soon, during this year, we will be saying goodbye and good luck to Nick O'Donoghue, our CEO. I'd therefore like to end by expressing my and the board's huge gratitude to Nick. Over the last 2 years, I've had the privilege to work with him on a wide range of areas, and he has always shown his characteristic thoughtfulness, as well as a deep and enduring passion for development, and a profound commitment to BII as an institution. Nick has led a transformation of BII over the last 7 years. He's transformed the scale at which we invest and change lives. The institution has invested over £9 billion in that period, while assets have grown from 5 billion to 8.5 billion. He's channeled a world-class team to include climate finance at scale to help the world's most affected. Critically, he has transformed our focus on impact and made the assessment of this scientific and rigorous. I know his legacy will be an enduring one. Thank you, Nick. Before I pass over to Nick for one final time, we have a short film which provides you an overview of the last year.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Diana. Thank you for those very kind words. As Diana mentioned, this is my 8th and final presentation of BII's annual review, so I want to begin by saying that it's been just such a huge privilege to lead this organization for the last 7.5 years. BII, CDC before it, is a really special organization with a fantastic history and extraordinary people. Now, when I arrived in 2017, I started by sharing 2 main goals with our board and our shareholder. The first one was to ensure that we really did put development impact at the core of everything we do. And the second was to build a world-class investment institution that would really position the UK at the forefront of development finance. And although we'd be the first to say that no institution is perfect, I think we've gone a long way towards delivering on both those objectives. As I've said many times before, development finance institution can't do everything, and we're not a panacea for every global development problem. We've always really been just one part of an excellent, much broader UK program. But I've always felt that if we have the right people, if we have the right processes, if we have the right partnerships, that there's much we can do to address the day-to-day challenges that affect so many people. Today, for example, 650 million people in Africa still don't have access to reliable power. 800 million people don't have internet and mobile access. 400 million people don't even have clean drinking water. So we at BII can build infrastructure that can help change that. At current population growth rates, Africa needs 10 million new jobs every year to employ its young people. We can provide capital that will help companies build new factories, that can grow new markets, and that can help create those desperately needed jobs. In many of the countries where we invest, women are effectively frozen out of the economy. They lack access to any form of credit. That limits their ability to grow businesses, to support their families, despite their ambitions. And we can use our funding to incentivize lenders to dedicate more to women-owned and operated businesses. Today in developing economies, small-scale farmers are battling the changing climate and the extreme weather events it creates. They can't even access or afford modern fertilizers or find buyers for their products, so their yields and income are too low to even support their families. And we can support at every step, whether that's helping them get the products to increase their yields or constructing processing facilities to help them create more value from their crops. And these are just some of the ways that development finance can change lives. However, of course, what we do is only worthwhile if it's making a palpable difference to people's lives and livelihoods. And in my position as the chief executive of this organization, I'm really lucky because I get to see firsthand the difference we're making. Most recently, I was in, for example, Tanzania. There we're supporting new forestry projects, new wind turbines, small-scale hydro projects, rural high-speed internet, mobile access, new credit facilities for women. And all of those investments we've made in the last year, and all of them in a country where private capital outside of development institutions is almost impossible to find. So what we provide is the investment that many countries' leaders are crying out for. And what I saw in Tanzania is reflective of what I see BII doing time and time again in so many different countries. So I'm really proud that we've come such a long way over the last 7 years, but I wanted now to talk a little bit more specifically about 2023. And I don't need to tell you that it's been another difficult year, both from a macroeconomic and a political perspective. The economic and humanitarian impact of events like COVID, the Ukraine war, the dislocation that all of that brought to food and energy prices, these things play out over multiple years. And we saw that all too clearly in 2023. In particular for us, the impact of large-scale currency devaluations in Nigeria, in Egypt, in Pakistan, to name but a few. This makes life difficult for our investees and makes sustainable investment very challenging. So against this backdrop and with this context, I feel it's pretty positive about what we've achieved. Our investment pace has remained broadly similar to 2022, with £1.3 billion of gross commitments, despite these headwinds. As I've said before, it's critically important that we earn a return on those investments. In that respect, 2023 was also a positive year. Our gross return across the portfolio was just over 5% in dollars. The appreciation of sterling in 2023 meant a more modest portfolio return in sterling of about 1.1%. But of course, it's important to view our financial return longer term, and our 7-year average annual portfolio return in sterling terms remains above 5%. The effectiveness, however, of a DFI should not be judged just by their own investments, but also by the role they're playing in mobilizing others, especially more commercial investors. That's a key objective at BII, and I was pleased last year to see us mobilize nearly $1 billion. So those numbers are all positive, but of course we're here really today to look at our impact both on people and on the planet. And indeed, one of the things that has changed most dramatically in my time at BII is our role in supporting UK climate finance investment and that transition to net zero in Africa and Asia. Importantly, every investment we make is screened for Paris alignment. In addition, last year, nearly 40% of our commitments met the official definition of climate finance, that is, projects specifically designed to mitigate or adapt to the effects of climate change. Last year, we made almost £450 million of new climate finance investments. Consequently, we're on track to deliver over £2 billion of climate finance during this strategy period. And that covers a real breadth of sectors and technology solutions, many of which are in the most challenging environments. This year, for example, that includes Planet Solar, Sierra Leone's first large-scale solar independent power producer, which is helping to address the country's desperate need for clean and affordable power. And SunCulture, a Kenya-based company that provides solar-powered irrigation systems to smallholder farmers, and we're going to hear from that company later this morning. And Battery Smart, which is building India's largest network of battery swapping stations for 2- and 3-wheeler electric vehicles. And when I visited the company last year in India, I got to see firsthand how our investment will help to increase the use of electric 3-wheelers, allows drivers to earn more, allows air quality to improve. Now, in conversations on climate change at COP or the World Bank or the London Climate Week, one of the things that you hear most often is that building more renewable power solves only half our problem. We need to bring massive private sector investment into grid transmission. And we'll not be able to use the new, if we don't, we're not going to be able to use the new renewable sources we're developing. So that's precisely why we set up GridWorks in 2019. We were willing to invest equity, start new greenfield projects, make a real difference in places like Burundi, one of the poorest countries in the world. And there, GridWorks is building a new company that's going to provide green energy to 70% of the population in a country where today only 12% have access. It's also leading multiple discussions with African governments on how to improve transmission and increase energy access. And we're going to hear more from GridWorks later this morning. Southeast Asia is another area which is facing growing energy demand. Economies there have almost doubled in size since 2000. It's also heavily reliant on fossil fuels, especially coal. And it's really no exaggeration to say that unless we can support Asia's transition to a greener economy, decouple its growth from its carbon emissions, we'll never be able to move the needle on climate change. So that's why our shareholder asked us to expand our climate finance activities to Southeast Asia. And I was very pleased that BII made its first investments in the region last year. And those investments range from financing clean energy solutions to transforming recycling and waste management supply chains. I personally had the opportunity last year to visit Solar Green Energy in Cambodia. That's our funding has helped build new solar irrigation that allows water to be taken from the Mekong River and provide irrigation to 500 hectares of small rice farms. So I wanted today to put particular attention on these vital climate activities, but of course it's also my view that even though helping countries transition to net zero will improve lives, it's important it doesn't distract us from making progress against all the other SDGs. And as Diana said, private sector growth is essential if we're going to eradicate poverty and achieve the SDGs. And it's going to be necessary to generate more affordable and accessible jobs and services, create more jobs and opportunities. Provide a tax base for governments to invest in social infrastructure and public goods. And I just returned last week from Pakistan. Tax collection in Pakistan is less than 10% of GDP compared with the OECD average of 34%. So there's a critical need to increase that by broadening the formal economy and the tax base. And BII's objective is to support that growth, to ensure the benefits are shared with poorer and more marginalized sections of society. And one of the ways that we can do that is by making investment available in local currency with terms that are accessible to young people, to women, to SMEs, to the smallest entrepreneurs. One thing last year that I'm particularly proud of is our launch of a new company in Ghana called Growth Investment Partners. And once again, it's an example of a new company started and entirely financed by BII, this time to provide higher risk, local currency-based loans to small companies in Ghana. And it's already attracting new investment from other DFIs as well as from local Ghanaian pension funds, and we're working to replicate that model across Africa. Another key area for us is our focus on empowering women, and I'm glad to say that in 2023, almost 25% of our annual commitments met the 2X gender lens definition. But our aim goes to further than just this target, and our aim in every country we invest in is to increase the number of women leaders, to hire and upskill more women employees, to ensure those jobs are high quality jobs, to ensure the highest standards in areas like safeguarding, to provide affordable products that meet women's needs. All the companies in our portfolio are required to have policies in place that support and promote and protect women. And I see real progress in many of the companies and many of the countries I visited, particularly in Africa. And in Africa, we're finding a rising wave of inspiring female leaders. And today, BII is proud to support the largest bank in Zambia, it's run by a woman. The largest bank in Tanzania, also run by a woman. The largest food company in East and Southern Africa, run by a woman, and to name just a few. So overall, I feel very positive about how BII performed in 2023. I hope that our annual review illustrates that, and I hope that you enjoy reading it. And finally, I also feel very positive about what we've been able to achieve over the last 7.5 years. I think we've built an institution that has achieved an enormous amount. It's recognized as a leader among all development finance groups. I think the strong institutional foundation that we've built is going to allow us to do much more, particularly in partnership with other financial institutions. We look forward to working with our new government here in the UK to go even further. And as I prepare to step down, I want to end by again thanking all those colleagues at BII and CDC before it for their support. Anything that we've achieved over the last 7.5 years is really a tribute to the talent and the commitment that we have both here in London and in all our offices across all the countries in which we invest. I want to thank Diana and our board for their wisdom, their challenge, their constant encouragement. I want to thank everybody at FCDO and the Department for International Development before it for providing us with all the resources to do our job, for giving us their expertise and opening their connections, and all the while respecting our independence as an investor. But most especially, I want to thank all our partners and investee companies. It's you who are doing the really hard work of delivering jobs and more prosperous lives in really such difficult economic and political environments. So I hope as I leave, BII can go from strength to strength, continue to play an important role for Britain in showing leadership on development and climate finance. And as I hand over the stewardship of this wonderful and vital institution, I know that my successor is going to build on this success.
We've now reached the time for the Q&A with our CEO and Chair. Thank you to everyone online who has been submitting questions. We have had a lot come through, so I might merge some questions into broader themes. Where I can, if you've provided your name and organization, I'll attribute the question. Diana and Nick's presentations have prompted some excellent questions, and as usual, they reflect the diversity and depth of our work. So let's get started. Welcome back, Nick and Diana. We've had quite a few questions through about our plans for mobilization. Samuel Gebrselassie of LEC Consulting, Tom Adlam at AgriFrontier, and Hugo Cox at Asian Investor all ask how we catalyze investments and partner with other investors. Mark Jackson at Michelle Dines & Co. also asks what can be done to get larger global investors off the sidelines to invest in large climate projects. Diana, do you want to respond to that?
Sure. So I think this is an incredibly important question, and it's a critical area of focus for us. It goes without saying that if we can take $1 of BII investment and multiply that to be $6 of total investment, we'll have a transformational impact on what we can do in these markets. I think there are some areas of mobilization, bringing in other DFIs, giving other investors assurance around impact, making them feel confident in that. pooling resources, for example, in the context of ARIA that you heard about on the panel, or creating an initial platform that can then become investable over time, like Ayana Solar, are great examples of where we're already making significant progress. But it's the mobilization, as you say, of other capital at scale that I think is a new and important area of focus for us. That is more likely to be in the infrastructure area and in areas of climate finance than it is, for example, in small-scale development projects in frontier markets. Part of the reason for that is that the ticket size and the scale of available investment, and part of it is the risk profile. But it is an area that we're giving really significant thought to, and we're thinking about how we structure projects differently in that context, how we structure portfolios, and how we create a climate together with those investors like pension funds and insurance companies that we can really mobilize that additional institutional capital. Nick, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, look, I think Diana really covered the key points. And I suppose, you know, from my perspective, I would add, I think, when we talk about a mobilization of capital, very often the discussion within the development finance community is around blended finance, and clearly, so basically giving some form of risk mitigation to attract these large investors, and that remains and will be a very important part of how we mobilize large-scale capital. But I think it does go, when we think about mobilization, it goes further than that. You know, we think about ways, for example, that we can recycle our own existing portfolio. We think about ways how we can help our existing fund managers raise money more easily. We even think about ways where we could potentially leverage our own balance sheet. So lots of different ways we can do it. I agree with Diana that the issue, the large numbers are definitely in climate, and that's where you have this massive appetite for capital, a large part of it in emerging markets, a large part of it in the places where we invest in. So we've got to be very focused on that. And then I think finally I'd say we also got to remember that often, I'm going to use Vietnam offshore wind as an example here. I mean, it's often the case that we need to do some preparatory work before we get to the stage of actually having to mobilize the capital. So for Vietnam offshore wind, you need seabed mapping. We don't have that. So I think as we think about how we use our scarce concessionary capital and grant capital, we should be focusing in on that whole enabling environment to make sure we can accelerate as much as possible the deployment of large-scale capital.
Thank you both for that. We'll change topics a little bit. Hester Leroux at CARE International UK asks how BII is strengthening women's economic empowerment and whether we've learned any lessons through our gender lens investing. Nick, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, well, I think, as I said in my remarks earlier, enabling greater women's economic empowerment is fundamental. Is a fundamental theme that goes across all our investments. I think we try to do it really at two stages. I mean, when we're looking at any new investments, and we look at probably hundreds of new investments every year, there's a whole process around diagnostics that we go through to really understand how the company's leadership, the company's employee base, the company's policies, to ensure that they're consistent with the type of what we would consider good practice. And then once we've made an investment with the companies we decide to invest in, then there's a whole implementation process, and we have a plan for every an environmental and social plan, action plan for every company we invest in. That always includes a plan around gender. We deliver throughout the life cycle of our investment a whole range of additional training, both to the companies that we invest in, to the intermediaries that we use. So it's really it's a sort of a cradle to grave approach to addressing this issue.
I'll follow up with another one for you, Nick, which is we've had several questions about our approach to financing SMEs. Derek Sanyumbi and Vincent Tattersall from 1888 Capital ask, how do we plan to address the SME financing gap?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. You know, we just came back from Pakistan, and one of the things we learned in Pakistan was that only 17% of banks' loan book is going, or it formerly used to be 17% of loan book. Now it's down to somewhere in the single digits. So clearly there's a gap here where local financial institutions are not really funding SMEs. And as we know, SMEs are the lifeblood of the economy. They're the foundation of most jobs in many of the countries that we invest in. So what do we need to do? I think we need more ways of funding in local currency, because that's too much of what development finance institutions provide historically has been dollars. That's typically not what SMEs need. I think we need to be much more flexible on how we do it in terms of terms. I mean, banks tend to have very rigid conditions around, security and repayment and those sort of things. So I think we need to try to be more flexible. I think we need to invest more in non-bank lenders, because, as I say, I think we can help through directing credit in the banks. We can help and encourage the banks to do more to reach this segment. But there's also an increasing role for non-bank lenders. We've seen that particularly vividly in India. A lot of fintech organizations that are using technology and using data to make smaller loans, and we can invest in those companies, give them more capital to grow. So I think there's a whole range of different things. We mentioned before growth investment partners in Ghana, which was our attempt to we said the best way to address this issue is start our own company and fund it ourselves. And then develop this higher risk, more flexible lending model, and that's what we're doing. And then we think, as I said, we expect to be attracting additional funding from other DFIs, from local Ghanaian investment funds. But I do think it's a really critical role for DFIs.
Super, thanks for that. We'll change topic entirely now and come back to you, Diana. We've had questions, given that this is Nick's last annual review event, and as the CEO of BII, are you ready to give some updates on the search for his replacement?
So I think the first thing to say is this has actually been an incredibly uplifting process to go through the CEO search. We've had a really exciting range of candidates, really immensely talented people from a diverse range of backgrounds. So I'm very happy with the pool of candidates we've had to choose from. As you can imagine, and as I hope you would expect, we've tried to ensure a sort of scrupulously equitable and disciplined process, and to make sure that that is rigorous in our assessment. I'm delighted to say that I hope we will be in a position to make an announcement in the near future. So please stay posted on this.
Okay. Perhaps preemptive, but Nick, we've had a follow-up question for you, which is, what do you think the next CEO should do better? Do you have any tips?
Yeah, look, I will have lots of tips for my successor on that, and I'm sure that my colleagues will have even more tips when they talk to them. Many of them will probably relate to being in a sort of better mood in the morning, before breakfast. But it's, I think if I had to look at one area where I think, I mean, we've made progress, but there's really just a lot more to do. It comes back to this question you asked earlier about mobilization. I mean, I think we're all aware, particularly as we become this, assume this responsibility for climate finance in our markets. I mean, we recognize that we're not going to move the needle unless we can mobilize large amounts of commercial capital. As I said, we've made some progress on that, but I think that's where you really have to, whoever takes my seat will really have to sort of double down.
Okay, thank you. We'll go back now to some questions on our investment activities. So Mike Morris from the Department of Business and Trade in the UK is asking, what are BII's plans for sustainable energy generation and transmission in Africa? Nick, would you like to respond?
So 650 million people today live without power in Africa. And that means they obviously can't power their homes, but neither can they power factories or schools or hospitals. So it's a fundamental issue in development which needs to be addressed. What needs to happen today, unlike, if we go back 10 or 20 years ago, is we need to address the issue through more sources of renewable energy. So that's obviously a huge, finding more ways of doing, whether it's solar or wind or geothermal or hydro projects across Africa is important. And it's disappointing when you look at Africa how little is actually happening, despite all the rhetoric and all the effort and all the talk. I mean, I think only 8 projects were actually reached financial close. Renewable energy projects reached financial close last year. So we really need to redouble our efforts. And the other area, and that was talked about when we did the earlier panel, Snowy talked about GridWorks. Transmission is absolutely fundamental. And this is not just true, by the way, in Africa. It's true around the world that we are developing sources of renewable energy and we are not figuring out ways to connect them to the grid. And that is a fundamental problem in Africa. It's accentuated by the fact that so many of the sort of state utility companies have significant debt issues. So I think that's a combination of more focus on actually getting projects done in a range of range of renewable energy, and also this real focus on transmission. Where, as I said, we're trying to play our role through GridWorks, but there's a huge amount to do.
Thank you for that. We'll zoom out a little bit and get back to sort of the heart of BII's mandate. Parisa Omar from Lightcastle Partners is asking how we balance the dual objectives of achieving financial returns and driving sustainable development impact. Diana, would you like to pick that up?
Well, I think, as you say, I mean, this really goes to the heart of what we do. And for more than 75 years, we've been trying to be thoughtful about balancing those two objectives. But I do want to be clear that it isn't a balance in the classic sense of the word. Our focus is absolutely on impact. And when we think about finance, we think about where we're additional and where we have impact. The return question is a secondary question, and the return we're looking for is not a commercial return. So as you know, the return that we're seeking is to clear 2% across the portfolio over a 7-year period. And that's a very, very different type of return seeking to others. The reason we seek a return at all is to enable us to preserve the capital base of BII, to enable us to invest and reinvest repeatedly to really have that impact and do good. So I think it's really important to see it in that context, but I think it's something that actually, if you look over the history of BII, with some few years of regrettable exceptions, and I think certainly very consistently in recent years, we've succeeded in doing.
Okay, great. We have questions about our presence in our markets. We've had quite a few come in. Vincent Tattersall also is asking us which African countries we're looking to invest in where we haven't historically invested before. We've also had lots of specific questions come in from across multiple markets asking how to get in touch with BII and asking what more BII can do in these countries. These have come from Pakistan, Rwanda, Sri Lanka, Ghana. Nick, would you like to tell people how they can engage with us?
Well, let me start with the first part of the question around sort of broadly expansion in Africa. BII has got investments today in 34 different countries in Africa, so that's probably as broad a reach or broader than almost any other investment institution. And I think we have the ability to make investments in any countries. So I think it's less about sort of picking individual countries, and obviously it's somewhat circumstances change too. I mentioned in my remarks being in Tanzania. Tanzania was a country that, quite honestly, was difficult to invest in. If I go back 5 years or more when I started, is now under new political leadership with a more stable economy, is suddenly really attractive and sort of at the sweet spot for development finance. So we put a lot more. So it's not a static thing. It's a moving target. But I do think it's more about doing as much as broadening. It's about being more focused and doing more in the tougher countries. And we heard the discussion earlier about ARIA, which is an initiative we started really to, as one of the speakers put it, mutualize resources and address difficult countries like Sierra Leone and Liberia and so on. And I think that's really where we need to, rather than thinking about breadth, we need to think about depth, and particularly depth in those more difficult areas. In terms of, I know we had a number of questions from people about specifically various countries, and Rwanda and Pakistan and Sri Lanka and so on. And there, I mean, the best way to get in touch with BII obviously is if you know we have 12 offices around our investment geographies. If you know the people in those offices, then you should contact, they're the best point of contact. And if you don't, you can always send, I know it sounds a bit sort of dull, but you can always send an email to inquiries@bii.co.uk. That address is monitored every day, and somebody, I promise you, somebody will get back to you if you do.
Okay, great. We've got quite a specific question from Danny Smith at WWF, who is interested in understanding how BII considers nature and biodiversity in its current strategy, and how this might develop in the future. Diana, would you like to pick that up?
So I think it's a great question. We don't specifically invest in sort of pure nature or biodiversity projects, but it is absolutely integral to how we think about all our projects, and very particularly our infrastructure projects. So I think I was talking earlier about Zephyr Power. I think that's a great example of somewhere where, you know, the sort of primary focus of the project is essentially generating wind power. But that area had seen really significant sort of, frankly, desolation and a change in its ecosystem. And it was incredibly important to reintroduce biodiversity into that environment. And so, as well as the windmills, there is now a very big plantation program around mangroves. And I was able to see the change in biodiversity that was happening. So there were real crabs, there were real lungfish, and we were able to hear from the local fishing communities about the positive impacts that had for them. It was also very interesting to see that in contrast to some other wind projects on adjacent land where no attempt had been made to do this, and it really was night and day. So I think any large infrastructure project that we look at, we're always looking at community and the environment and biodiversity there. So it's critically important, and will continue to be.
Okay, thank you for that. With an eye on the time, I might start wrapping up this session. We had a really interesting question from Simone Dunn, who asks, the development sector is always changing. How might the investment approach change over the next decade or two? One assumes an ever-increasing focus on climate-related work, but what else might change? And I might ask you both to respond to that, starting with Nick.
Yeah, so we're talking 10, 20 years. I think this question is absolutely right. The climate is going to be a dominant theme. I think you will get much greater segmentation in terms of countries, particularly middle-income countries, particularly in our case, many of the countries in Asia. I think our role will be very focused around climate, because I think we have a huge responsibility in the developed countries to help with the support the transition to net zero in those countries, and that's a huge task. I think the rest of our work will get increasingly focused on the lower income countries, and many of the viewers will have seen that in the white paper, for example, we committed to having 50% of our investment go to lower income countries, and I think that's almost a non-climate part. Will be very focused on the lower income countries. And then I think finally this, and I mentioned this theme earlier on in the context of mobilization, I think that we know we can't solve these problems without large amounts of commercial capital. We know the development finance institutions are very well situated to really support that process. So I think that theme of looking not at what we're investing off our own balance sheet, but looking much more about what we're able to do in terms of bringing other people along with us will be a more and more important theme.
Anything to add to that?
No, I think that Nick summarised that well. I think the one thing to call out is it's getting harder, and it's intentionally getting harder. We're trying to raise the bar on ourselves. We want to have that focus on low-income countries, and the climate challenge globally is becoming more significant and more urgent. So those two areas of focus, I think, are absolutely the hard part, but they're absolutely where we want to focus.
Thank you. I think that was our final question. Thank you, Nick and Diana, for your candid responses. I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thank you for all your questions, and I am sorry if we didn't manage to get around to everyone's. We do very much value your engagement during these sessions, and I know that many of you will keep the conversation going with us in the coming months, and we look forward to that. So that concludes our event today, but before we close, I'll hand you back to Diana for her final words.
Thank you, Huma. So let me leave you with just 3 things. First of all, I wanted to encourage you to read the annual review. I'm always struck when I go through the pages of our annual review by the sheer scope and the number of activities that we're involved in, and we don't have time to go through all of those today. I hope that you will be struck, as I am this year, by the volume of those activities, and I hope the difference that BII is making in the world. We've tried over the last couple of hours to give you a sense of that. Secondly, I wanted to thank our partners and investee companies who've joined us today and work with us every day. For me, it's meeting the people who run the companies that we invest in that really gives us the understanding for what we're doing. I hope the last couple of hours have given you a sense of that and why we're so excited about it. A sense of the extraordinary impact that these people and companies can have in their markets and the reason why development finance remains so important. Finally, a big thank you to all of you online. You're our partners. You've worked with us to generate that impact. And you've also scrutinized us and kept us on our toes. We're looking forward over the next year to continuing that engagement to increase our commitment even further to the development impact we can have across your markets. Thank you again for attending and have a good day.